So, we are close to the release of Crash Bandicoot 4. It's about time. So, I thought it was high time for me to rank all the mainline Crash Bandicoot games. Let's talk about it.
Whoa!
What's up guys, Canadian Guy here, and back with a brand new Crash Bandicoot video. So this has been a video that's been a long time coming. Crash Bandicoot 4 is just around the corner, and we are about to begin hopefully a brand new age of Crash Bandicoot games. But before we step into this brand new era, I want to look at all the previous eras of Crash and rank them. There have been many Crash games that have come out for consoles, phones, portable consoles, Tiger, Tamagotchi knockoffs, you name it. Crash probably has a game for it. But for today's video, we're going to focus on the mainline console Crash games. So games that released on consoles that involved major platforming. Those games are the following 8 titles: Crash Bandicoot, Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, Crash Bandicoot Warped, Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex, Crash Twinsanity, Crash Tag Team Racing, Crash the Titans, and Crash Mind Over Mutant. Insane Trilogy does not count because it's a remaster of the original 3, and I could just set that as number 1 and call it a day and be a cop-out. I also know that Crash Tag Team Racing is kind of up in the air. It has platforming like a mainline game, but also has racing like the spin-offs. I personally do not agree that it fits in the mainline title sequence, but many others do. So I decided to go to Twitter to ask you guys, and well, you guys are pretty much split down the middle. So for safety's sake, I did include it on the list. We're going to start from what I think is the best Crash game and make our way down to what I think is the worst. I had a hard time putting this list together, and I'll let you know where I had struggles because there were some that I had a hard time placing. Now, if you love Crash Bandicoot and any other kind of platforming game that brings on the feeling of nostalgia, then I recommend that you subscribe to stay up to date on all kinds of videos. Number 1, and the one who takes the crown, is Crash Bandicoot Warped. I think Crash Warped falls into 2 categories for fans. They either think it's overrated or it's their favorite, and to me, it falls as my favorite game. Crash Warped was one of my most played games on the PlayStation 1. The gameplay feels the most refined out of all the games that came out from the original trilogy. The environments, especially in comparison to the other games, just pop out much more to me. The variety of level designs and concepts are also unique, making the game just stand out a bit more. The addition of playable Coco levels are also absolutely awesome, and some of them are my favorite levels in terms of overall design. The music also really resonates with me deeply. The Crash Bandicoot Warp theme is beyond iconic and was remixed over and over and over again for future titles. The Warp Room music still gets stuck in my head at random times through the day. The characters and villain cast, I think, is the best the series has to offer. I mean, you got Dingo Dial, Entropy, Tiny the Tiger, and Engine that fit perfectly as Cortex's band of time-traveling misfits, and I think overall is the best cast of bad guys out of any Crash game. Cortex also really hits his stride of being a good balance of being comedic and trying to be evil. Of course, the game still has its problems, like the fact that there are a lot of vehicle levels, the difficulty curve is a bit weird because of the fact that the level progression is not linear, and other small nitpicky stuff. But overall, Crash Bandicoot Warped is my favorite Crash game of all time so far. It also gets a little bonus because it contained a demo for Spyro the Dragon. So yeah, it takes the crown at number 1. Number 2, Crash Bandicoot 2. Crash Bandicoot 2 hits a lot of notes that Crash 3 hit, just some of them don't quite make as much of an impact. What pushes it down to the second spot is not the gameplay, the environments, or even the level design, but the cast of villains didn't really impact me as much as Crash Bandicoot Warped did. The music also isn't quite as overall impactful as Warp's were, though it was still very good. And the jetpack levels were also kind of bad and controlled horribly. But most of the positives that I have for Crash Warped are the same for Crash Bandicoot 2. So this is why it takes the second spot overall. It's still a great and fantastic game and one of my favorites. However, just a few things knock it down to the second spot. Number 3 and 4 definitely was a challenge. See, a lot of people would have assumed that I would say Crash Bandicoot 1 hits the third slot and called it a day. But there's actually a contender in my eyes. See, Crash 1 is great. It's what started it all in terms of the legacy of Crash Bandicoot. But one that definitely fights for that third spot is Crash of the Titans. The first thing I want to say is that Crash of the Titans was not as bad as what a lot of people had told me. Character designs aside, and some really cringe and cheesy dialogue, the gameplay was solid. The combat was smooth, the combos were fun, and a lot of the Titans were fun to play. However, the music never really hit me as much, and it definitely pushed out a lot of the major difficult platforming elements that the original Crash trilogy really thrived off of. So while the original Crash Bandicoot is the weakest of the original trilogy, I loved the progression system that it had in place, which was changed in future games. Honestly, both of these games are really good, and some days I would say Crash the Titans hits number 3, and other days I would say the original Crash Bandicoot 1 would take the third spot. But I have to take into account that Crash Bandicoot was what started Crash's legacy. Without its success, there wouldn't even be a Crash of the Titans. They honestly were tied in my mind, but for that one reason alone, I give the number 3 spot to Crash Bandicoot 1 as an honorary note, and the number 4 spot to Crash of the Titans. But both games are still very good. Number 5, Crash Twinsanity. Ah yes, the cult fan favorite, Crash Twinsanity. Twinsanity is actually an interesting case of a mishmash of good ideas and concepts with multiple degrees of successes and failures. Twinsanity's awkward spot in the Crash fanbase is kind of on the shoulders of both Universal and Traveler's Tales. Universal just being the trash that they were, and Traveler's Tales just not being able to handle their time and scope of project properly. The writing of Twinsanity is, at certain moments, the best in the series. This is by far the best Cortex that we have ever seen, and if you haven't played the game yet, you should just play it for the sake of Dr. Neo Cortex. Twinsanity makes Cortex the perfect balance of cynical and evil with slapstick and comedy. Though they may have knocked Cortex's dialogue and writing out of the park, this is about the only thing that the game aces at. The game has so much cut content as well that it's actually stupid. There might actually be more stuff that was cut from the game than what actually made it to the final game. Again, poor handling of time, and Universal being the literal worst. It feels like Traveler's Tales just took the most big sections of the game, cut them out, and strung them together with a loose string. The game is buggy, obvious assets like sound effects are gone, and overall the impact of the game was really affected by the mismanagement of time. There are shining moments in the game, there's no doubt about it, but overall I feel like the game is really loved more for what it could have been than what it was. Still though, through its shining moments and bland downfalls, it hits dead center of the list. Number 6, Crash Tag Team Racing. This game, to me, is the definition of meh. Tag Team Racing was an attempt to make the game a perfect crossover with its original platformer roots to its unexpected racing spin-off success. In terms of racing, I feel that it really misses the mark. It's loose, bland, and feels like all the other kart racers for its time. The combination mid-race aspect, however, I will say is pretty cool. The idea of fusing with different racers to get different guns and just blowing other racers to Kingdom Come is pretty cool. The platforming is, again, meh. Nothing too difficult. Very basic semi-open world exploratory platforming. The game doesn't fail by epic proportions by any means, but it also doesn't really shine in any aspect either. Some of the minigames were fun and have great ideas, and the combination concept during racing is really cool. But that's about it that stands out to me in Crash Tag Team Racing. I don't hate it, but I also don't like it. Now we get to the final two, Both of these games are hard to choose. The final spots are Crash Mind Over Mutant and Crash Wrath of Cortex. Oh boy, these are the only Crash games that I can actually say that I think they suck. I loathe them. I hate them so much. There's so much that's wrong with both of them. So let's start with Mind Over Mutant. While Crash of the Titans was fighting to be the top of this list, it's kind of sad that its direct sequel is fighting to not be at the bottom. Crash of the Titans introduced brand new mechanics and ideas to the Crash universe. Then Mind Over Mutant found a way to just take those ideas and somehow make them worse. The first thing I noticed while playing the game was that they decided to make the camera automated and make the right analog stick Crash's spin. Yep, that was a conscious choice. Why don't we just make Spyro's Fire Breath be flicking down on the right analog stick while we're at it? So now that the camera is on the rails and you can't control it for a semi-platforming beam-up, what else could they do? Hey, I know, let's take a on-the-rails camera and make it semi-open world. Yeah, that seems fun, making it more interactive to traverse. And you know what everyone else loves in their open world games? Backtracking! Yes! I love to run back across the map of the game, go through the same areas that I did before, only to break a single rock 3/4 of the way through one of the areas, hit a switch, and run all the way back. It's so much fun, am I right? Then, for some reason, they decided to make the game harder, which is fine, except for the fact that they also decided that iframes are the thing of the past. Now, if you don't know what iframes are, usually after you get hit, there's a few moments where you are invulnerable. This is clearly defined in the original Sonic games. This makes it so that you can recover and kind of stabilize yourself. But Mind Over Mutant though? Nah, you get caught even once, you literally get curb stomped into the ground by mobs of enemies and there's nothing you can do but die. Fun, right? There are so many aspects about Mind Over Mutant that just missed the mark completely. If there was one thing that even stood out to me, it would be the mixed media cutscenes. There were some that were really funny and really cheeky, while others were a bit, odd. Even the best part about the game has me feeling mixed. But let's move on to the Wrath of Cortex. Everyone knows I hate this game. The Wrath of Cortex was developed by Traveler's Tales, and this was the first major platforming game that was developed outside of Naughty Dog Studios. And sadly, this was not a good first step for Crash. In fact, I would argue it was one of the worst. The Wrath of Cortex was originally Crash Bandicoot Worlds, where Mark Cerny was going to be the lead. If you don't know who Mark Cerny is, he's the lead designer and programmer on the PlayStation 5, and has been a part of Sony for many years, leading and designing other projects. Originally, Universal and Sony had some sort of partnership with this project, where Cerny would work with Traveler's Tales to make a brand new Crash Bandicoot game. But something happened behind the scenes, and a falling out between Universal and Sony was the result, having Cerny lead the project and the Traveler's Tales team having to restart. But instead of giving them more time, Universal just thought it was okay to give them 1 year to finish a brand new Crash Bandicoot game from start to finish. So the Wrath of Cortex was born from this absolutely terrible, awful idea of just giving them 1 year, and I gotta say, it's shocking how bad this game looks, feels, and overall plays. I get it, it's 2001, the game's graphics aren't the best looking, but they look significantly worse than the previous platforming title, Crash Bandicoot Warped, and that was on the PlayStation 1, in comparison to the Wrath of Cortex being on the PlayStation 2, so I'm having a hard time making that excuse. I mean, look at Entropy. Somehow, his PlayStation 1 model looks better than his PlayStation 2 model. Also, look at Tiny the Tiger. What is actually wrong with him? He looks like he was beaten to death by a vending machine. The only decent looking character in the entire game is Uka Uka. So I suppose it's good that they got the piece of painted driftwood with anger management problems right, but everything else in the game just looks significantly worse than Crash Bandicoot Warped. The platforming also falls flat on its face. It's floaty, it's not responsive, and it just feels so bad. Then the game has glitches galore that causes you to die and also straight up crashes, no pun intended, all the time. And the loading screens, when running on hardware, they just take forever. There is very little good that can be said about this game. It's basically a bad Crash Bandicoot Warped clone that butchers every aspect about it. If I were to say something positive at all about this game, I would say that the music is actually pretty good on some of the levels. You can really count on the classic platformers to produce excellent music. The other thing would be Crash Bandicoot. While he was not used to his full potential in Wrath of Cortex, I love his character in future games, especially in the modern day take in Crash Team Racing Nitro Fuel. So I suppose there's that for Wrath of Cortex. So, which trash is more stinkier than the other? Well, after much deliberation, the game that takes the #1 spot as the worst Crash game of all time is The Wrath of Cortex. Though Mind Over Mutant is a slog to get through, it has its shining moments. And there is also a difference between unwise and not good game design and the game just not being done yet. Unfortunately, Wrath of Cortex was a barely baked game that barely held together or even functioned. The graphics for Mind Over Mutant also were more acceptable for its time than Wrath of Cortex's, as Crash Bandicoot Warped looked even better than Wrath. So Crash Bandicoot, The Wrath of Cortex wins the crown of trash, sitting at the bottom of the tier list. So that was my subjective and comprehensive list on the best Crash games, starting from the best and going down to the worst. What did you guys think? Do you agree or disagree? Comment below and let me know. And don't forget to subscribe for more Crash Bandicoot content. Thank you so much to all those who not only support the channel, but myself and my family. Because of your contributions, I'm able to do this full time. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider clicking the join button or becoming a Patreon with the link in the description. I also live stream every Thursday and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Come on by and say hi. Again, thank you to everyone, and I'll see you guys in the next video and or live stream.